For me, a great British castle is a fortress, a palace, a home. And a symbol of power, majesty, and fear. For nearly 1,000 years, castles have shaped Britain's famous landscape. These magnificent buildings have been home to some of the greatest heroes and villains in our national history, and many of them still stand proudly today, bursting with incredible stories of warfare, treachery, intrigue, passion, and murder. Join me, Dan Jones, as I uncover the secrets behind 6 great British castles. This time, I'm at York Castle, at the heart of one of Britain's most ancient cities. In its long history, it's witnessed all sorts of malice and mayhem. It's where kings like Henry VIII made a bloody example of their enemies, where one of the worst religious massacres ever seen in Britain took place, and where the most notorious highwayman in history met his end. It's a castle packed with thrilling stories that go back nearly 2,000 years. This strange stone tower, built in the shape of a 4-leaf clover, on top of a steep mound of earth, in the middle of an ancient walled city, is one of the most unusual fortresses in Britain. York Castle, together with its 19th century jails and courthouse, has been a centre of royal power in the north of England for almost 1,000 years. In fact, its significance goes back even further. For almost 2,000 years, the Romans, Vikings, Normans, kings of medieval England have all seized upon the strategic importance of this site. All of them left their mark, which is why the castle and the city, surrounded by 2 miles of stone walls, is one of Britain's most famous historical sites. York's medieval castle saw invasions, uprisings, show trials, and religious slaughter. By the 16th century, the fortifications beyond the castle had been thoroughly extended and updated. A high stone wall, over 2 miles long, now totally encircled the entire medieval city. It was studded with gates known as bars. Manned by the king's men, these kept strict control of the traffic in and out of York. This is Micklegate Bar, one of 6 gates in York's old defensive walls, which once controlled access to the city and to the castle. This is where kings and queens would enter York. It was also where the heads of traitors would be stuck on spikes and left to rot as a warning to anyone who was thinking of rebelling against the crown. And no one ever used these gates to more dramatic effect than King Henry VIII. During his reign, York Castle was swept up in a violent rebellion against the crown, and the dreadful retribution that followed. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the church in England, and across the country, all references to the Pope and the Catholic Church in Rome were removed. To some people, this was long overdue religious reform, but to others, it was little more than state-sponsored vandalism. Henry VIII's Protestant Reformation was a direct attack on the Roman Catholic faith. Some of the biggest symbols of Catholicism were England's monasteries, like St Mary's Abbey just across the road from York Castle. In 1536, Henry's men came here and tried to shut the abbey down. Monasteries like this one were big employers, and people relied on them for work, education, and medical care. But Henry closed this abbey and dozens of others like it, stripped it of its assets and seized them for the crown. Eventually, for the conservative, Catholic people of northern England, this was all too much, and they rose up in rebellion against their king. This rebellion was led by Robert Aske from Selby, just 14 miles from York, who gave his uprising a stirring and very deliberately Catholic name: the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was the worst revolt of the whole of Henry VIII's reign, turning the north upside down for 3 months, as up to 35,000 people rose up against him. Robert Aske was a lawyer from a well-to-do local family. He was also a gifted public speaker and a disciplined organiser. In October 1536, Aske led a procession of 5,000 men through the streets of York, here to the Minster, and he posted on the door a petition calling for the monks and nuns to be returned to their religious houses. He also wanted a Parliament of the North held here at York, and a pardon for all those involved in the rebellion. Henry VIII's representative in the north, the Duke of Norfolk, presented the rebels' petition to the king, who then asked to meet with Aske. Naively trusting the king's good intentions, Aske left Yorkshire and headed to London. But by the time he arrived, King Henry had changed his mind. He had Aske arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, where he was charged and convicted of high treason. Then, to further drive home the point, Henry had Aske taken from London back to York Castle and paraded in chains in every town he passed through. When he arrived at York, Aske was taken to the castle for the final stage of his ghastly punishment. His sentence read, "You are to be drawn upon a hurdle to the place of execution, and there you are to be hanged by the neck, and being alive cut down, and your privy members to be cut off, and your bowels to be taken out of your belly and there burned, you still being alive, and your head to be cut off, and your body to be divided into 4 quarters, and that your head and quarters to be disposed of where his majesty shall think fit." When they were finished with him, what was left of Aske's body was hung in chains from the walls of the castle, so the people of the city could see just what happened to those who rose up against their king. Aske's uprising was the bloodiest chapter of Henry VIII's entire reign. Over 200 of the rebels across Yorkshire received similar punishment. It was intended, Henry said himself, as a fearful warning to anyone who dared defy the king. And Aske wasn't the last Catholic dissenter to be imprisoned in York Castle. 50 years later, during the reign of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, a woman called Margaret Clitherow also defied the monarch's ruling on religion. The fate she suffered after coming to the castle was arguably even worse. This is the Shambles, one of the oldest streets in York, and in Tudor times there were as many as 20 butchers' shops here. And this is where, in 1571, a woman called Margaret Clitherow moved when she married her husband John, a wealthy butcher. 3 years later, Margaret converted to Catholicism, and soon she was one of the leading figures in York's underground Catholic community. Margaret was determined to cling on to her old faith. Not only did she hold illegal masses in her house, she was also suspected of hiding outlawed Catholic priests. In this chapel in York, I found evidence of just how dangerous that sort of thing could be. This is a priest hole built to hide Catholic priests from the authorities. And you can imagine just how scary it would be to be the person inside there. It's small, it's dark, I imagine it's pretty cold as well, but if you were hidden away in this hole, you'd know that it was better down there than up here, because if the authorities caught you, then your fate would be very grisly indeed. Eventually, in 1586, Margaret's home was raided and a priest hole was found. She was arrested and taken to York Castle to prepare herself for trial.
When Margaret was brought before the court, she wouldn't say whether or not she was guilty. She knew that under English law, that meant a trial couldn't go ahead, and that crucially, her children wouldn't be called to testify against her. Unfortunately, English law had a way of dealing with people who refused to plead. It was called peine forte dure, better known as crushing. Margaret was taken from the court. She was laying on the floor with a stone the size of a man's fist beneath her back. Then a door was placed on top of her, and onto that was piled about 700 pounds of other stones. Margaret was literally squashed, and the stone beneath her back snapped her spine in half. It took her about 15 minutes to die, and even Queen Elizabeth I was shocked when she heard about it. What was the point of pressing someone like Margaret Clitherow to death?
It's so horrendous, so exquisitely savage that no one would dream of not entering a plea, that they would all accept trial by jury. That's the theory, but Margaret didn't.
Why?
Well, there are many reasons. She said that she wanted to preserve the consciences of her jurors so they wouldn't have to make her, find her guilty. She also wanted to protect her children and her servants from testifying against her. That's what she said. Some people think that she was seeking martyrdom. People were trying to get her off. That 10-day period or so between her trial and her pressing, everyone was going to her cell trying to get her to plead. And there was even one stage when a jury of women examined her to see if she might be pregnant, and they came out and said she probably was pregnant. So there is a sense that she's accepted her fate already, and she's going in as a willing martyr.
It's believed that her body was eventually dug up and given a secret burial. Or at least, most of it was.
So, James, show me what's inside here.
OK, Dan, I just opened the cupboard. The hand of Margaret Clitherow.
So this is the hand that was taken from Margaret Clitherow just after she'd been pressed to death.
That's right. I understood that basically after her execution, friends of hers recovered the hand from the body, which, in all honesty, probably was one of the few items left.
You can sort of feel it, actually, can't you? Because if this is the hand of this woman who endured such sort of terrible hardship and brutality, and here it is right in front of us, then it becomes much more than just a story, doesn't it?
You can't but be in awe by looking at something like this,
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
By the 19th century, most of this once great fortress had either crumbled away or been demolished to make way for new buildings such as the prison. Eventually, all that was left were the outer walls of the city and this one structure, still standing proudly on the hill, York Castle, known locally as Clifford's Tower.
York's famous for its cathedral and its city walls. But I love this curious castle, 55 steps up on top of its hill. From Viking raiders and Norman conquerors to a Tudor saint and a notorious highwayman. It's the stories of York Castle that really put this historic northern city on the map.